captured goddess. A long, long time ago, a young girl regained consciousness in a small, dark space, thick with the stench of blood. She couldn't move her arms, her legs, or even her mouth. The only thing she could do was stare into the darkness with wide open eyes. The last light the girl had seen was the fire that burned with people as its fuel. Its awful glow had illuminated the hand crawling all over her. After that, she had felt something cold pierce her body many, many times. And then, blackness. That was all she could remember. What am I? Suddenly, the girl was freed from the darkness. The starry sky opened before her dazzled view, its faint lights too bright. Desperately, she moved her eyes, searching to see herself, but the familiar lines of her body were gone. In their place, a ruined mass of blood and quivering flesh. The girl let out a voiceless scream. As she did so, a black shadow obscured the stars. A monster with long fangs was kneeling over her, lowering its gruesome maw towards her face. In a moment of white agony, her ruined flesh contorted into a sword and lunged at the monster's head, stabbing it between the eyes. Carrion-maker. The iron club was placed at the corner of the torture chamber. After prisoners had been subject to every conceivable form of torture, it would make an appearance. With their bodies in mutilated ruins, victims longed for the iron club's fatal blow and an end to the pain. From toothless mouths, they would wail, "The club! The club! Please, show me the club!" And like a bloody angel, the iron club would come to answer their prayer. The weapon turned its victim into meat with a single crushing blow, then waited in silence for the next prayer. Caked in flesh and blood, it came to resemble the bodies it violated. Deathdance. Long ago, in a war-torn region where a small nation constantly fought for supremacy, one country thrived under the leadership of a great hero. In time, he became an emperor, and his armies conquered the neighboring lands. Exhausted by years of war, the conquered subject of this new emperor welcomed his rule. The emperor held a feast from time to time. It was the one luxury he allowed himself. Disregarding the advice of his council, he would even entertain guests from enemy nations. That day, he had invited a beautiful dancer to perform for him. She hailed from a country which had resisted his conquest for several years. The dancer possessed such beauty and grace, she stole the emperor's heart in an instant. At the end of her performance, he applauded generously and ordered her to approach his throne so that he might reward her. As he reached out to hand her a priceless ring, she stabbed him through the heart with the sword she'd used in her dance. Bereft of its emperor, the empire soon crumbled, and the flames of war engulfed the region once again. War brought suffering and death to the people of every nation. The assassin's sword was lost, but its story and cruel legacy remains. Flamberge. The dragon faced certain death. He lamented. Why had he tried to save the life of a wretched human child, only to fly straight into the trap of dragon hunters? With his consciousness fading, the dragon thought he saw a man fighting. When he awoke, the man was treating his wounds. The man who saved the dragon's life aspired to become king. The dragon was not interested in such matters, but he thought that he would make a fine ruler. Suddenly, an arrow pierced the man's chest. The dragon hunters had called in reinforcements. Critically injured, he groaned and fell to his knees. Struggling to his feet, the man fought back bravely, but his wound was slowing him down. Just as it seemed he was about to be overwhelmed, the sound of tearing flesh filled the air. The dragon had torn out its own tongue. When the man pierced the tongue with his sword, a wall of flame spilled out, burning the dragon hunters to ash. "I'd hate to sacrifice myself for a mere human, but I do not wish to live with your death on my conscience," said the dragon as he closed his eyes. At that moment, a bond that transcended species was forged. With Flamberge in his hand, the man later became king. Glory's Bane. This sword belonged to a royal family whose kingdom was destroyed by an evil dragon. The vengeful rage of the family smolders deep within the blade, hidden by the sword's gaudy beauty. Whoever takes up the sword will suffer from the family's bitter curse. Evil dreams will haunt the victim's nights till he is overtaken by a baleful death. A king of a certain small nation was struck by the sword's beauty and took it for his own. But he too became plagued by nightmares, and one day his life and kingdom were taken from him by dragons. There is but one means to escape the sword's curse: slay the same dragon that killed the royal family. But no man has yet possessed the strength to cheat fate and break the spell. Hunter's Joy. A lord with a penchant for hunting once owned this sword. With it at his side, he would ride out into the forest and not return until he had slaughtered all the animals he could find. Several decades later, when the lord's grandson inherited the title, he also inherited this sword. The new lord was a gentle soul and wasn't fond of hunting, until the day he found this sword among his grandfather's possessions. From then on, his interest grew and he began to make frequent hunting trips. As the months passed, the young lord's behavior became more and more eccentric. He would lick the food off his plate and was sometimes seen walking on all fours around the castle. Then, one day, he disappeared. No one knew what had become of him. Only the beastly roaring could be heard, echoing from deep within the castle dungeons. It is said that it can still be heard to this day. Kingsblood. Once there lived two generals. One possessed supreme bravery, and the other possessed supreme intellect. The two men admired each other and trained together to become better soldiers, until one day their hearts were stolen by this ancient sword, Kingsblood. They fought to decide who should own it. The battle for Kingsblood led to war. The brave general fought using what he called Iron Guard formation, a strategy dependent on sheer effort and hardship. It had served him well throughout his glittering military career. The astute general, meanwhile, used strategies never before seen in the battlefield. No one knew who would prevail. The brave general's direct approach dominated at first, but as time passed, the astute general's ever-changing strategies began to turn the battle to his favor. So the brave general's army held on with dogged determination and managed, at length, to cancel out the astute general's advantage. The war had reached a stalemate. After the war, a villager visited the battlefield and said, "They were both great generals. If only their talents had not been polarized. If only they had possessed a balance of might and intellect, we would have been spared the tragedies of war." Mage's Promise. There once was a man, strong of limb, who lived in a poor village. A caring fellow, he decided to join the army and earn a better life for his fellow villagers. Grateful for his gesture, they presented him with a silver club before his departure. To the kind-hearted man, the battlefield was hell itself. Stunned by the gruesome reality of war, he ran away before even swinging his club. Dejected, he returned to the village. To find it burned down to the ground, his people massacred. Despairing, he cursed the heavens, cursed his weakness, and pleaded with the devil for more strength. Back on the battlefield, he swung with the blind fury of a wild animal. In the end, he split his own head open with it, and only the cursed club remained. Maiden's Cree. A short sword lay at the corner of the altar in the shrine. During its construction, the sword was used to take the lives of sacrificial maidens, whose blood was offered to earn the blessing of the gods. The number of maidens sacrificed is the number of pillars. Each of the maidens who died against their will cursed the sword with their last breath. Soon after the shrine's completion, the priests fell victim to disease and misfortune. One by one, their order dwindled, and the shrine was eventually abandoned in the wake of the war. Several hundred years later, the shrine still stood. Resting on its forgotten altar, the cursed sword remained, casting an eerie light around the murdered maiden's tomb. Pitch Black. There once lived a man to whom killing was as essential to life as breathing. There was no special reason why he murdered. He was not driven by bloodlust. It was only that murder was all he knew. One day, he encountered a group of thugs who had surrounded a helpless girl. As usual, he murdered every last one of them without hesitation. When he turned to kill the girl, he found her thanking him with tears in her eyes. It was the first time that anyone had ever thanked him for what he had done. As he looked at her, he finally realized that his actions had meaning and purpose. Smiling, with happiness in his heart, he brought his sword down on the young girl's head. With kindness in his eyes, he paused for a moment to watch the pool of blood expanding around her crumpled form before leaving the scene feeling greatly fulfilled. Savior Blade. Once upon a time, a land faced destruction due to the deception that corrupted people's hearts. Mourning the state of his realm, the king passed a new law, sentencing to death anyone who spread false hope among his people, with lies that the country was being rebuilt. It was then that a merchant appeared before the king with a sword that only killed liars. The king rejoiced and paid a good sum of gold to purchase the sword. Eager to test his miraculous acquisition, the king swung the sword at the merchant and clove him clean in two. The king mourned once again. Scream. The young man lived to trick young girls. Gleefully he stole their hearts and wealth. But in time, the women he'd scorned banded together and sought the help of the fairy king, who sealed the young man's spirit in a sword. Trapped inside the cold blade, he came to regret his sins. Then time passed. The women grew old, and one by one they died. With each woman's death, time, which had been halted, returned to the man who had never known old age within the blade. As it did so, his hatred for the women who had imprisoned him grew. When the last of the women died, the curse was finally broken, and he regained his physical form. Once the young man's body had been restored, his desire knew no bounds. He tricked one woman after another, stole hearts and wealth, until one day he met a beautiful young woman and fell in love for the very first time. He gave her all his life and wealth, but she felt nothing for him and left town with another man. The young woman committed the same crime as the young man, and, in time, the men she'd scorned tried to seal her spirit into this sword. Just as they were about to cast the sealing spell, the young man pushed his beloved out of the way and took her place inside the blade, which was turned red by his passion. There he remains. Sealblade, Calamitous melody. A master blacksmith, embittered by the gods' maltreatment of the world, vowed to forge a weapon with which to destroy them. The power of the seal negates the power of the gods, and the seal derives its power from the goddess. So the blacksmith sealed the power of the goddess into his creation. She was a goddess whose heart concealed a forbidden love. She was a pure goddess. Sealed inside was life. Sealknife, Calamitous strings. A master blacksmith, embittered by the gods' maltreatment of the world, vowed to forge a weapon with which to destroy them. The power of the seal negates the power of the gods, and the seal derives its power from the goddess. So the blacksmith sealed the power of the goddess into his creation. The goddess lived for her love. She gave her body for the sake of her beloved. She was a fiery goddess. Sealed inside was the fire, the spirit that nurtures the life of the red earth. Writheheart. Once there lived a girl, fair and pure. Born into a life of poverty, she was sent to work as a maid in the home of a noble family. There, she was treated like an animal. After months of hard labor and abuse, her mind and body began to fail her. The only one who treated the girl with any kindness was her lord's youngest son. He comforted her, and soon they began an illicit affair. The doting girl lived for the short midnight meetings, alone with her lover. Late one evening, she made her way to the meeting place at the usual time and found her lover waiting for her. But he was not alone. With him were all of his brothers and sisters. Smiling like demons, they encircled her and forced her to the ground. She lost consciousness when she caught sight of the cruel grin on her lover's face. The next morning, the girl limped back to the mansion. In her hands, she held a beautiful sword. When she caught sight of her lover, she lunged for him without a word and pierced his and her own heart. Steeped in their lifeblood, the fatal weapon took up the scorned girl's bitter hatred and has been cursed ever since. Hero's Knife. A couple was elated by the news that they were to have a child. As this was their first, their friends held a feast the next day to celebrate. Many came to the party. Among them, a prophet dressed in a richly embroidered clerical gown. The prophet presented the couple with a short sword and said, "This blade will make a master swordsman of the wielder. Use it to protect your children." When the husband grasped its hilt, he felt its power coursing through his body, making him stronger. This was no ordinary sword. "The child who will be born is a child of heaven. The child who will be born is a child of man. Should the child bring disaster upon mankind, kill it with this sword." The couple's faces paled, and the husband raised the sword to strike the prophet, but he had already disappeared. After the day of the feast, the wife, unable to forget the prophet's words, grew ever more gloomy. The husband used the power of the sword to become a soldier and returned home ever more infrequently. Eventually, their child was born, or rather, a pair of twins was born. A beautiful boy and girl. Oror's Falconblade. Once, one of Sir Gizmo's men was caught attempting to steal General Oror's sword. When he was brought before his master, Sir Gizmo harshly reprimanded the knight and threatened to execute him. The knight pleaded, "I only wish to be more like General Oror." When Oror heard this, He interrupted Sir Gizmo and began to speak. This sword was crafted after the elfin myth of two brothers who became the gods of destruction. The older one was called Falcon and possessed the gift of knowledge. The younger one was called Lion and possessed the gift of might. They fought in a war between humans and elves. Using their gifts, Falcon and Lion brought mankind to its knees. But with the end of the war, there was no one left to test their skills against, so they continued their quest for knowledge and power. Eventually, Falcon gained the knowledge of the universe, and Lion cracked open the earth and sky with his fists. The brothers had become the gods of destruction, and the elves had no choice but to seal them in heroes' time, using the lives and souls of millions. Your crime is the same as the brothers, but in the name of my sword, Gizmo, I beg you, spare this man. And so the knight was spared, but I never forgot the darkness I saw in Gizmo's eyes that day. Oror's Lionblade. Violence, death, ruin. 18 years ago, Oror was a general in the army of the Union and led his forces against the armies of the Empire. During one fateful battle, a catastrophe befell the world, and lightning rained down from the skies, killing Oror's men where they stood. Loss, starvation, disease. The heroes saved the world from chaos, and the war ended quickly, but the wounds caused by the catastrophe were felt by mankind for many years to come. During that time, Oror traveled the world trying to bring hope to the people. Their pitiful plight broke his heart. Flags, armor, spears. Oror had learned that the heroes had formed a band of knights, sealed the fire, and were now working to save the needy. Knowing that he could not save humanity alone, Oror willingly joined the knights. With knights under his command, he dedicated his life to saving as many people as possible. Death, love, hate. Caught up in the internal politics of the heroes, Oror lost his life. Gizmo was the culprit. However, Oror did not hate Gizmo for his crime. His love for humanity would not permit such hatred, even for his murderer. And so Oror remained true to his way of life until death. Nowe's sword. This sword belonged to a hero called Iron Dragon of the Two Swords. It was a gift from a female knight who trained him for his first battle. It saved the lives of many, including the Iron Dragon. He cherished it as though it was his own body. One day, Iron Dragon entered the Hidden Land, led by a priest's divine guidance. There, he met a dragon who spoke the words of men and a child who spoke the words of dragons. Iron Dragon knew right away that this must be the legendary savior and asked for custody of the boy. But the dragon sneered. What right have you to take this child from his father? What could you possibly offer him? And Iron Dragon replied, I shall become the child's father. Without knowledge of human ways, this child would grow to become a wingless dragon, a pointless creature. I vow to raise him to be a fine knight. So it is a future that I offer to the child. Amused, the dragon said, Fine. You shall take the child, but I shall come with him, for only I can teach him the ways of dragons. Iron Dragon agreed and presented his sword as a token of his pledge. The dragon sneered at the foolish human gesture and threw the sword into his lair, the only world his child had ever known until then.